Hi guys, welcome to week 2 of debates about debate strategy. Okay, so in the last week we talked about debates about banning, a very common type of debate. This week we're going to talk about debates where you are required to solve a crisis. Now, there might be some overlaps. You're going to ban something because there is a crisis. But these debates are different in the sense that they're not just asking you to ban. Ban is a very specific type of action, just to ban, to remove something, to make something illegal. But in these debates, you may be asked to make a proposal, to defend a new idea. And often those ideas can be pretty controversial, right? They could be things that society has never done yet. You are the first person ever to propose doing some of these crazy things. But we're doing these crazy things because there is a huge crisis. Okay, so we're going to discuss this type of debate and then look at 3 different debates which I think can fit into this category, right? And keep in mind, we are discussing this template or this model so that you can choose to apply it, right? You can look at a debate and say that I want to make this debate about a debate about, make this debate a debate about solving a crisis. And this is how I'm going to approach it. And that gives you some control over the debate. Okay, so let's break this debate down. Now, the most important thing in this debate is the crisis, right? So the crisis needs to be incredibly harmful and to be urgent, right? So it needs to be time sensitive. You need to do things now. Millions of children are dying, not just dying, being tortured and then dying. And we need to act now, and not acting is immoral, is unacceptable, will have multiple harms in the short term and in the long term to everybody because it's a fantastic, gigantic, ginormous crisis, right? It's an existential crisis. If we don't solve this crisis now, we are, expletive. Yeah, definitely gone, right? And you're doing this, you're making this thing so urgent for a few reasons. One is to give you a moral high ground, right? Because sometimes the proposal that you're going to propose may require you to do something controversial. Like I said, maybe we're going to kill a few people, or we're going to assassinate someone, which pretty terrible things, and you'll need to sacrifice some high ground there, but you're trying to build it over here, okay? And the second reason you're going to do this is to put an onus on your opposition to solve the problem, right? Because remember, if I'm proposing a pretty controversial policy, then my opposition's definitely going to attack that policy. They're going to say it's harmful, they're going to say it's useless, they're going to say, it makes people look bad, they're going to say it wastes lots of money, right? Opposition teams love to do that. And if you're prepping for opposition, that's exactly what you need to do. Okay? But so if you don't make the crisis incredibly urgent, then you give opposition a free pass to do all of these things, and you're going to lose ground, right? So the most urgent thing there is for you to develop the harm from the crisis and develop the urgency of this crisis. Okay? Now, you need to then show that your proposal is solving the problem, right? So in order to do that, when you're developing this crisis, make sure you try to talk about the root problem, the crisis. So what are the causes of the crisis? Talk about the stakeholders, right? Now, a common mistake a lot of teams make is they oversimplify the problem. They say, this is the cause, this is one cause, and this is the one type of person that is involved in it, right? You use phrases like the people say, people want. Who are people, right? There isn't really one group. Every group can be desegregated, can be split into smaller groups or different stakeholders in order for you to better understand the problem. There also very rarely is one cause. There tends to be multiple causes, okay? Now, you don't have to say that you are going to solve all the causes of the problem. Neither do you have to say you're going to please all the stakeholders. What you need to show that is your solution here is part of the solution. That your solution is important. It's an important part that we need to use for now. And maybe in the long term, we can give it up. And, maybe if you have a better solution in somewhere else, we can forget about this. But right now, this is part of our strategy. And we need to do this in order to solve all the problems that are existing, right? So this way, you are managing expectations, right? You're not saying that with this, everything is solved, but you're saying that with this, we can solve these things, which are really, really important, and then we can do something else to solve other stuff, okay? Now, you need to make sure that your solution, whatever you're proposing, solves enough of the crisis or addresses enough of the problems so that it's worth it. Don't reduce your onus so small to say like, okay, this is only going to solve 5%. And because it solves 5%, we should do it. If one life is saved, then it's okay. Maybe, and you're right, that every single life is important. But if you reduce your onus so tiny to such a small part, then you're going to have more harms that outweighs whatever benefits. And it makes you seem useless, okay? So you need to match the degree in which you're solving the problem to the extent of the problem, right? So if I say the crisis is huge, okay, so in terms of all the crises we've faced in society, or maybe we don't need like a scale. I say like huge crisis is gigantic, right? It's ginormous. This is the scale of the crisis. I paint a very huge, diverse picture of problems. Then I must solve at least a significant portion of this. I don't need to solve everything, right? But I need to solve, I don't know, maybe half of it, or I need to solve an important part of it, right? The part that relates to other parts of the crisis. Something like that. But I need to show that the solution that I'm proposing is significant, right? It has a clear role here, right? And that's your approach to debates about solving a crisis, at least from Gov. Make sure the crisis is huge, right? That the crisis is significant, the crisis is urgent, so that you compel the other team to act. Then break down the crisis into the key components, the key causes, the key stakeholders, and show that whatever you're proposing will have a significant impact, right? A real impact, and it's hard to ignore this, right? And you can say that, yeah, other things are okay. You leave space for mutual exclusivity, okay? So if the other team wants to talk about other solutions, or you can see, yes, we need to do other things and we'll need other problems to solve, and that's fine, but this stuff solves this, which is really important. And it gives you some control over the debate, right? So what do you do from opposition? Now, from opposition, in debates about solving a crisis, the first thing you do is question the crisis. Always in opposition. If you can show that there isn't really a crisis, or that the crisis is being solved in the status quo, and we don't need to panic, right? Relax, don't panic. That gives you a huge advantage because it makes whatever the government is doing unnecessary, right? That's the first thing. And if what they're doing is unnecessary, then all the harms that they are incurring is also unnecessary, right? So if you can develop harms, you will show that we don't need these harms at all. Because sometimes maybe some harms are necessary. We need to give up some tax money, we need to suffer, we need to not sleep as much as we can usually sleep because we need to be able to do something, right? So that harm to my quality of life, to my enjoyment is necessary. But if there's no problem, then that harm is unnecessary. So the first thing you try to do is show that the harms are unnecessary. Yeah, you understand what I'm trying to say there, okay? So that's number one, right? And for that, you show that there is no problem and that there is many harms. Okay, so if the Gov team doesn't properly develop the crisis, then you can lean a lot on this approach. If the crisis is pretty clear, then it's hard for you to say that there is no problem, right? So in step two is, if you can't show there's no problem, is you concede crisis, but say that solution fails. Okay, so solution fails to solve problem. Solution fails because it increases harms. Right? Because in some contexts, maybe the solution is so radical that it solves the problem. Right? But it causes too much harm that in itself is another problem or a bigger problem. right? If you want to eradicate poverty, don't have poor people. Sounds pretty terrible, but some countries have tried to do that, like sterilizing poor people so they don't breed, if you make it as part of the crisis that you're trying to solve. But then you have to ask yourself, why am I actually trying to solve this crisis? If that's my goal, to come eradicate the problem. Okay, so I'm simplifying here, but I hope you can understand that what you're doing on OP is to show that their problem, their solution doesn't solve the crisis, or in trying to solve the crisis, they actually cause way more harm, right? By trying to eradicate the problem, then you lose the principle, right? So what you're trying to do there is try to take the moral high ground from OP. If their crisis, if the solution is very, very radical, okay? Now, if they've done a good job developing the crisis, you can't ignore it, right? If the crisis is ignorable or manageable, then you can say that their solution failed, their solution makes things worse. It's better off for us to try the things that we're trying in the status quo. We need a long-term approach, right? And that will be a big kind of philosophical distinction between both the sides. I'm trying to scroll here, okay, right? So in trying to solve the crisis, the proposition team, because you develop urgency, you need to react in the short term. You can have long-term solutions as well, but you need to act now and immediate. The OP will talk about a more long-term approach, right? So the OP will say the problem is very complex. We need long-term approaches. We need to do other stuff, okay? So if it's not so, if the crisis isn't that clear, OP can say that this part will be enough. It doesn't solve it, you're not causing more harms. It doesn't solve it and you're causing more harms, right? But if the crisis is really, really urgent and they can show that they're doing something significant, even if they're not solving the crisis, they are reducing the harms, then it's hard for you to say, let's just wait, let's not take this, right? Because there is a net benefit that is being proposed by the other team. And in that situation, you, an opposition, need to provide some kind of alternative. Okay? So you need to say, we need to do something else. That alternative needs to be mutually exclusive, meaning that it's got to be one or the other, because if it isn't mutually exclusive, the other side is going to take it, right? Unless you can show that it's not mutually exclusive, but you don't need the other solution if I have this solution, right? If this solution works, then the other solution doesn't work, then or is not necessary. Then it is mutually exclusive, right? Because you don't need to have both, right? So having your proposal, your approach, will remove the approach on the other side, or remove the necessity to have that on the other side, right? So I think what you need to do here, now of course, keep in mind, these problems are all incredibly complex. If they could be solved in a 30-minute, 45-minute prep and 7-minute speech, they would have been solved. Or assuming that, we are of equal intelligence to the politicians who are trying to solve these problems. In many cases, that's not true. Our intelligence far surpasses theirs. So maybe you will have a better idea. But my point is, you don't expect to solve the entire problem. What you are comparing are approaches to solving the problem, right? So you need to compare why your approach in the situation is better than the proposition team's approach, okay? Because neither of you will be able to prove comprehensively that the problem will be solved, right? So when you provide that alternative, I think it's really important for you to contrast your approach. Okay, and this is interesting, right? So what I mean here is, if the opposition is taking a kind of utilitarian approach, a kind of interventionist approach, for example, approach using high-end punishment, you take a deontological kind of approach, a principle-based approach. You take a low-on intervention approach. You take a carrot-based, encouraging-based approach, right? If they are bottom-up, you try to be top-down, right? If they are, very kind of go it alone, you try to be multilateral. So you contrast your philosophy in this situation. And then so the debate becomes a comparison of that philosophy, and you can show why your philosophy works better in this context, right? So that's one. If sometimes you find it can be strategic to take the same philosophy. In that case, you're not comparing or contesting the moral high ground. You concede that the morality isn't really an issue, or the philosophy isn't an issue, but you have another approach that is similar to their philosophy, but is different. Okay, so maybe they want to assassinate leaders, you want to assassinate someone else. Then it's a comparison over who you're assassinating. So your approaches aren't philosophically different, but it's more of like a minor approach. It has advantages in the sense that you're not competing on the moral basis. You concede the urgency of the problem, but the disadvantages are there's very little that separates you and the proposition team, right? You've conceded a lot of ground, and unless there's a huge difference from the specific differences in your approach, like who you're assassinating, then it's very likely you may be conceding too much. Okay, because they have all the principal arguments in that context. If they can show that they can also, extend their proposal to take on your new targets, then you will very clearly lose that debate. Okay, so that's the position from OP, right? On OP, number one is look at the harms. If you can show that the harms from this proposal are unnecessary, and you can do that if they don't really develop the crisis, great, good for you, run with that line. I think that's super strategic. If they do develop the crisis and you can't say there is no crisis, concede there's a crisis, but look at their solutions. Say that their solutions fail, it doesn't solve the problem, but leads to loads more harms. Let's just live in whatever we're living with now and keep working on long-term solutions. That could work if the problem, if their solution doesn't have a significant net benefit. But if it does, then you need to provide an alternative. You need to provide an alternative vision, an alternative solution that shows you are doing a better job at addressing the problem. And often here you'll start competing over the causes, right? The root causes, remember I talked about earlier, and the stakeholders. Maybe you'll come down to a competition on that. Which ones are indeed the main causes and which ones are indeed the main stakeholders, okay? Excellent. Let's take a look at this from a slightly different view. Right, so this is the map. You should have this in your books. If you don't, you have it now. But it's pretty much what I said earlier, right? So from proposition, what's key is there is an urgent problem. You have an obligation to act. You cannot do nothing. Right? So you are trying to make the other team do something so that you can compare the things that you are doing. Otherwise, it's a comparison about whether you should act or not act. And if the act is very extreme, then it may be better for people to say, let's not do extreme things. Let's just wait and see, right? If you can really develop the crisis, then you can run this line. The action is not perfect, but will lead to a more preferable situation, okay? On OP, on average, if the crisis is pretty clear, because it's clear in the motion, it's clear in reality, even without the other team developing it, then concede. Okay, don't live in an unrealistic world. Concede there's a crisis, but it makes it worse, doesn't solve the problem. You need a better approach. Talk about why intervention isn't good, you need to take a different approach, long term, top down, something, a different philosophy. All right, so this will be your contentions. Types of arguments here will be very connected to solvency and the need to act. Right? Why we need to work, how the solutions will work, why we must act now, why acting will send a positive message, right? So you can extend that, why it creates a positive precedence, why there'll be many other benefits in the long term, so on and so forth. Okay? On OP, focus on that solution. No, we need a different solution, different approach, why it sends a negative precedence, why there'll be more harm in the long term, doesn't solve in the short term, etc., etc., etc. Right? So a lot of the focus on the argumentation, focus on the solvency of the crisis, but also these long-term precedence message types of arguments. The major clashes, I think, will come down to the solution. Right? will it work or will it not work? And it needs to be matched, the solution needs to be matched with the extent of the crisis. If the crisis is really extreme, but the solution is really small, it's very hard to show you're doing anything significant. Okay? So this is the comparison of the approaches versus the crisis. And then this second one is a more overall view. Solving the crisis is number one, right? But if there is a deadlock on whether or not it will solve the crisis, not solve the crisis, then you can step back and say, like, regardless of the crisis, there may be some other issues, some long-term benefits, precedents, how it impacts some stakeholders, how it impacts another category of problems. And we can't solve this, we don't know about this, but we do know it causes more harms here. Well, we do know that there's more benefits there. So maybe we'll decide on that secondary, long-term issues. That's another way to look at it or to weigh the clashes in the debate. Okay? Excellent. Of course, you need to put this into practice. Let's quickly discuss a few issues here to give you an idea. Okay, so what I want you guys to do now, and what we'll do together, is try to frame these debates based on the discussions that we just had. All right? So the first one is that this House would pay other countries to accept our prisoners. It's a very radical approach. I don't know any country who actually does kind of do that, although countries do some things that are kind of similar. And this is also an interesting strategy. When you have a proposal that's like really controversial and you seem far, out left field, whatever, you can show how there are precedences of other things that are similar. So while no one actually pays countries to accept prisoners, countries do trade prisoners, right? So things like with extradition or with rendition, taking prisoners and holding them in other countries, keeping them in different areas so that you can change your accountability over those prisoners, right? Guantanamo is a big example of this. There's also precedents where countries or governments privatize prisons and put them in the hands of other people, right? So when a prison is privatized, the staff, the management is different, and you've kind of abstracted that management. I've given it to another group of people to manage, and I've just given them some instructions, and I've paid them, and they're running it, right? So if I was, city of California, well, not the country of the government of California, state governments, and I privatize and I send prisoners to a private prison in my country, I'm kind of outsourcing them, right? What if I send them to a private prison in a different state, right? Maybe up North Carolina. I'm also kind of outsourcing them. So why not send them to a private prison in Mexico? It's actually closer than sending them to North Carolina. Maybe, maybe not. May work, may not work. But the idea is you, even with a very controversial proposal, or maybe especially with a very controversial proposal, find precedences, right? Find things that we already do in society today that are kind of stepping stone to this new proposal, right? So because we already privatize prisons, because we already do things like rendition in some situations, right? If we need to, if we can show there is a necessity, then what we're proposing here is an extension of those things. And because we do those things, there's a precedence and we can continue. We've learned, we know how this works here, so we can do more. Okay, so that's a general thing that you can do when you talk about proposals that are very controversial. Okay, so what is the crisis here? Yeah, that's one. Overcrowding of prisons is the problem. Okay, a big problem, especially prisons in the developed world. Developed world and in the developing world, right? We are quickly learning that the solution of putting people in prison doesn't always work. And what you do to them in prison also, the effectiveness varies. And maybe we need to rethink that. Okay, so but overcrowding is also very complex. So overcrowding because of the types of crimes, overcrowding because rehab fails, and overcrowding has different harms. Putting people in the same place together means that you have very poor resources, you can't manage them properly, Also, the type of people you end up putting together can be problematic. I mix, low-level and mid-level and high-level offenders together because I don't have the ability to effectively segregate them. That's also very problematic. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to do here is break down the crisis, identify the crisis, but talk about the specific harms within the crisis and talk about the different facets, the different aspects of it, and then show how this solution can deal with maybe some or all of them. Okay, so paying countries to accept prisoners doesn't change the law, right? But it's not mutually exclusive. I can say that this is one part of it, that I'm okay with modifying the law, getting rid of 3 strikes and stuff like that, because maybe we don't need to send this many people to prison. But we do already have lots of people in prison, and we need to do something about that, right? Because that's affecting their rehabilitation. And so how do we move people around to lower that, to make rehabilitation more effective? How do we separate people based on the types of crimes and stuff that they commit, right? So that's me developing the crisis. And as I'm doing this, you can see now I'm trying to think of the solutions, of the arguments, right? And how it's going to work. So moving people around means that it can improve the rehabilitation. And if I have more space, I can separate people based on the type of criminals, right? There will be some model stuff you'll need to do here. You'll need to talk about who we're going to move, where we will move them to, how the move will happen, okay, and so on and so forth. It's a very complicated approach. What I think you should do is, again, so if there are precedences, go back to that, right? Always try to use precedences. So think about it. In the status quo, can prisoners choose which types of prisons they go to? Are there different types of prisons in the first place? Yes, they are. Private, non-private, high security, low security, some with a beach view, some with, well, no view really. And prisoners do get some choice, right? Or at least they can use it in plea bargaining. You sure watched quite a lot of prison shows. You don't actually need prison experience for this one. I can choose to go, or not choose to. I can negotiate, appeal, try to go to a low security prison, which will give me as a prisoner more freedoms, right? And I know I just need to serve 20 years, but at least I can do it in a place where I'm allowed to go for walks, right? Versus a maximum security, or a prison like in Siberia or something that's really, really cold. I don't want to go to that prison. I want to go to a different prison. And so I'll give you something. So this can be part of that. Assuming that the prisons overseas that you're going to send them to will be worse than the prisons domestically, which is a fair assumption to make, because I'm not sure really good prisons overseas have the capacity, one, to take people. And if you're going to pay that much, you might as well build more nicer prisons back home, right? Then this will be something prisoners can have some kind of say in, right? So think about things that exist in this current status quo and how you can adapt that to your model, right? And the arguments you will make then are about how it will improve rehabilitation, how it reduce the crisis, and focus very much on the short term, okay? And you can bring other arguments in, right? So it could be an interesting way to manage the load, right? Building more prisons means, and if you privatize them, there's an incentive for the private companies to keep people in the prisons, right? They don't want to abolish ever, to get rid of prisons. So they want to keep them there. Otherwise, they will lose money. So maybe rather than building more prisons, we need to think about how we can move load around. And why not move them to countries that have more capacity? If these countries exist and if the capacity exists, maybe that could work, right? And you talk about how a lot of what you will do here is talk about how you can still get the benefits of rehabilitation if you can move them. And you will be talking about the benefits on 2 levels, the people who have been moved and the people who have stayed. Okay? There are plenty of arguments and, crisis there. But what would you do from OP? Thinking. So if the crisis is well developed, hard for me on OP to say there is no crisis, right? So I concede there is crisis, but I focus on another part of the solution. So I maybe focus on this, on crimes. I focus on making rehabilitation more effective. I focus on some other things, right? Changing the way we punish people. I think a good thing to do on OP is to talk about how we can have community-based sentencing. So keep people in the community, right? There's no need to go to prison. Use electronic bracelets or house arrest or different kinds of types of punishment that keep them out of prison. And this even means reducing sentences for some people, taking them out. This, we feel, and some literature has showed, will increase rehabilitation, both for people who don't have to go to prison and people who are inside, because now there are less people there, more resources can focus on you. Excellent. And why that's better for everybody, better for the community, and so on and so forth, right? So a big thing on OP, I think, is showing this philosophy and why this philosophy is beneficial. And secondly, harms. And there are plenty of harms, right? Harms the prisoners when they go overseas, who's going to be accountable for them, right? Harms rehabilitation, harms their family members because they now can't keep in touch with them. So many different levels of harms. Build those harms down, make them more serious than the actual crisis. And if you can do that, that gives you on OP a huge advantage. I need to pick up my pen. Now I have my magic pen. Okay, so that's the debate on paying prisoners to accept, paying countries to accept prisoners. Let's look at another one, and again, take the same approach. Allowing governments to monitor citizens' emails and social networking profiles. Step 1, crisis. Okay, so the crisis here, people will talk about, say, international terrorism, inter-country international crime, and because, focus on the solution, right? So because we have more ways for criminals to communicate using email and social networking, we can have more crime. So you don't actually have to focus specifically on international terrorism, although that's very serious. Terrorism is far less common than international crime, like people smuggling or gun running or drug smuggling. But the harms of it is more extreme because 1,000 people are dead and it becomes a huge focus. Okay, but you can be broadly focused on crime. I don't think you need, and again, but it's very complex, right? So this solution won't solve all of it, but it's a better tool. Okay, focus specifically on international organizations because of the whole emails and social networking aspect, and this will help you narrow it down. So you talk about this specific cause here, and you talk about the types of stakeholders. So people who are young, people who are overseas, why we need to be able to get those things, and we don't have it, so government should be allowed to do it, right? Okay, so and arguments you will develop then is on effectiveness, why we can solve, talk about the necessity, why we need, and go into detail with your stakeholders and your causes, and this will really help, right? Now on OP, again, it's hard to say that there is no crisis, okay? If you can develop this well, it's hard for me on OP to say, no, that doesn't happen, there's no international crime, stop panicking, you sound like a fantasy person, right? So a fantasy person, unrealistic, crazy, okay? So don't do that. I think a big thing here is on harm, right? So why the harm you are proposing here can be intangible, like the loss of privacy, and you need to make this more tangible. You talk about why the loss of privacy will lead to loss of trust, right? And then why you really need trust. Because in your alternative, it's about greater collaboration, right? And why we need to have more collaboration to overcome these things. Why citizens need to trust each other, why we need to stop people from joining crime, joining terror cells, etc. in the first place. And we do that by increasing collaboration, increasing trust, increasing democratic principles, right? Otherwise, we've lost the war in the first place. So you see what you're trying to do? You're trying to take a more long-term and big picture approach, right? Where the other side will say, yeah, those things are important, but that doesn't help us in the short term, right now, to solve these things. There's an urgent crisis, okay? You say that will not solve the crisis, but will only make it worse, and show how this will not work. And here, so you compete over the causes and stakeholders, right? So remember they said, these guys use all the internet and email and profiles, and we listen to everybody, we're going to figure them out. And you say like, yeah, maybe that's true, but they will use other things and they will change and they will find other ways, and you won't be able to figure them out. They will know, okay? Or they will know that you are. So there will be some competition over that specific stakeholder, right? And you need to get into the more in-depth you get over the type of stakeholders and the specific causes, they'll make your analysis better, right? So again, same model, focus on the crisis, look at the causes of the crisis, look at those stakeholders, right? Talk about whether the solution will work or whether it won't work or whether it will lead to more harm or less harm. Same debate, right? Or you can extend to how other things will help, whether those other things will be enough, whether it will not be enough. Last debate, paying teachers according to the performance of students. What is the crisis here? Teachers are not paid enough. That's a significant crisis, I think. But maybe not the key thing. The crisis here will probably be a crisis with education, right, and performance. You can break this down. So the standards are dropping. This leads to increase in private ed, right, non-state led, which leads to more segregation in societies, gaps between rich and poor. So the principal long-term value of education to create more cohesive societies, which you will argue is one on Gov, is failing, and even the basic level of education to develop capacity of students are failing. Okay, so we need to do, because teachers are not motivated. So a lot of this has to focus on teachers specifically. And the problem of education is complex, right? It's about students, it's about community, it's about parents. But here you're going to look at teachers and schools and why your solution, so this is you trying to be more focused, right? Not broad, but focus on teachers and why this will help teachers improve. By focusing like this, you can say that other things are also important. Yes, we need to bring parents on board. Yes, we need to have better role models for kids. Yes, we need to do other wonderful things. But what about the teachers? We need to do something for the teachers. Why will this work with the teachers? Okay. Then show your solvency. Talk about why. So here you can talk about why it works. Talk about why it's fair. So this thing is not so radical that you can actually take on the fairness aspect of it, right? So you don't have to. You can take the moral high ground here. Say why this is something that maybe should have been done before, isn't done. Draw more parallels to the corporate world, etc., etc., and build that into your case, right? Precedents. On op, hard again if they develop the crisis well to say crisis doesn't exist. Education is fine. Education is perfect because you come to the school maybe, but what if you didn't? What if there were problems elsewhere? So hard to say it's not. The tricky part is to say that pay shouldn't be connected to performance of teachers. I think what you can do here is really discuss the word or the meaning of performance. And you need to show why teaching is different from working in a company or a business. Performance isn't the number of kids who go through your class, the number of A's you generate. Performance needs to be evaluated in the long term. Kids who drop out of school can still be wonderful, amazing, sometimes even more amazing human beings than those who get straight A's, right? So how are you supposed to develop as a teacher if you're constantly focused on just test scores and test scores? And maybe on Gov, they will have to define performance more subjectively. But again, if it's defined more subjectively, it's really hard to evaluate and make your pay based on that. Okay, so I think that has to be the strategic approach on op. And this is you addressing the solvency, right? So yes, we need to make teachers awesome, but we don't think this helps them. You want to portray yourself as a much more vigorous defender of the rights of teachers, and give them more leeway. Find other ways in which you can reward teachers without having to focus it on their academic performance or the academic performance of their students. Okay, so again, huge crisis. Does it solve the crisis? Does it not solve the crisis? what are other things we can bring in, or an opposite philosophy on the other side, right? On the gov side here, you want to be very kind of corporate, very recognizing reward, performance. On the op, you want to be more, long term, not short term. You want to be more subjective and less objective. Okay, and those things should be more than enough for you to build vigorous case and lots of argumentation. Right. So the big picture here is, remember, a template, right? What are debates? What do debates about solving a crisis look like, and how should you approach that debate? Do a few debates and try as much. Don't try to think about the debates separately. Try to think of them as a type of category. That way you get better at debating a category, not just a specific debate. And if you're better at a category of debates, then you can take that skill and the arguments and quickly apply them to different categories. All right? Hope you've had fun, and good luck debating debates about solving crises, many problems.